Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Coach Support Show, where science meets strategy. Now, this is our 10th episode. So, Watson, how do you feel about 10 episodes in?
Yeah, this is fantastic news. Hi, everyone. Hi, John. This is fantastic news because for various reasons. I think one of them was I've been told by numerous hosts and podcast producers that actually 10 episodes is the hump. Like if you can get past 10 episodes, pat yourself on the back. That's a real milestone. And I suppose, I think I tried and failed with a previous podcast where we kicked one off. This was 5 years ago now, 6 years ago, about sort of current matters in esports. And I think the host and I we had a few good conversations, but the ideas ran dry after maybe 6 or 7, and we had to start getting guests in, and then we sort of we lost some momentum. So personally, it's very meaningful to get to that 10 number. The fact that we've still got something interesting to talk about is great, and also it's been nice just to see like the growth in sort of viewership. So that's been very exciting. But yeah, mainly because I've heard from numerous different people that 10 is the hump. If you can push past 10, you got something, and that's really exciting. So thanks, John.
Yeah, I mean, it's been good. Don't say that we've got something interesting to talk about yet before we actually start the conversation. But that does bring us on to what we're talking about today, which is, can we measure potential or even skill like in League of Legends other than just how high elo you are or something like that, or like the eye test and all those kind of things? And before we start, I'll talk about kind of why this is something that I've been thinking about and why there's something I've been interested in. Last time we talked, it wasn't last week, but last time we talked about ways to make EU better. And I think it's very important as a coach or as anyone who's involved in this kind of competitive high performance that you realize that, of course, we can have an impact. Of course, nurture, the environment, those kind of things are really impactful. And of course, as a coach, you make a big difference on how your team performs. But the team that wins is the team with the best players. I'll always use this example. When Pep Guardiola at one point was asked, why are you the best coach? He said, I've got the best players, straight away. No thinking. Like, you have to just be aware of that. You can be confident, cocky and all that if you want as well, but you do have to acknowledge that. So a key factor in how we make Europe as competitive as possible is making sure that we find the best talent. So anything that we can do to make sure that that happens is going to be really useful and is going to be something that we should take really seriously. So that's why it was kind of on my mind in general. And then more specifically, I've recently found a YouTube channel which does cool, well-edited, well-researched videos with interviews in on a range of different topics, very much in the same vein as us, science and sport more than esports. And he did a video fairly recently on a new athletic test called the S2 Cognition test. You can find the video if you're watching on YouTube. The video is in the description, or you can just type S2 Cognition into Google and you'll find their actual official website. And so I wanted to kind of think about it and explore it, because whether people realize it or not, and whether you want to admit it or not, this is the holy grail, as it were. If you can find the best players, that's the biggest step to winning in EU or winning internationally. So that's basically why we're doing it in general. What did you think about this when I first sent it to you? How about this as a topic?
A bit terrified, if I'm honest, because there's obviously on the surface level a lot of appeal to, as you say, trying to solve this and get close to something that resembles like an answer that can really help in practice. Like if you can identify talent and do some sort of test to predict the kind of talent that you're getting, and have with some and say with some confidence that this is going to work, this player I'm signing is going to be successful, that's fantastic. And we know that it takes a lot of effort to do that. So if you can boil that down to a test or something like that to be able to make those predictions, then you're onto something, as you say. But terrifying for me because over the years, I used to be a lecturer on a master's program in sports psychology, and you touch on the psychology of sort of cognitive testing and intelligence testing, and it's a field that's hard to grapple with, because you have to understand a little bit about like what are the potential upsides of these tests, what are the potential flaws, and why is that. And then within sport specifically, over the last decade or more, there's been a lot of thought put into how do things transfer onto the field, so to speak. So how can a test result transfer into performance? And it's a big topic, and maybe terrified for a podcast because part of it is rusty, maybe, but also esports is this new environment where perhaps it applies even more than it might do on an American football field, which was a big theme in the video you mentioned. So I'm a bit terrified, but yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to think about, and what you would test for, I think is really interesting.
We can get into all of that, but again, we should. I talked about this obviously just before we went live. Like you mentioned there, it's something that people are like really interested in, and I think it's definitely worth acknowledging that we tend to be, or people tend to be, very easily convinced about the things that they want to be true. And so the example I think here of this is perfect. There was a test involved in originally just the NFL, but I think they actually did it widely, called the Wonderlic test from the 1970s, where it was about, can we test football IQ? Can I ask you a series of questions? It was even a written test, I think, that was supposed to determine, would you be a good American football player or not? So yeah, we can see how fast you are and all that kind of thing, but now we also get to test your brain in this great way. In the 1970s, and it was absolutely everywhere. And in 2022, they stopped it kind of officially, because it was even officially a part of the NFL, kind of everything, everyone would talk about the same test, standardized test. And one of the lines in the interview, there was an article about why it was cancelled. And one of the lines that really stood out to me was something like, we found no statistical significance between the score of the test and the on-field performance has ever been documented. So from 1970 to 2022 is a long time. For 50 years, we're running this test that has never shown any documented correlation. And after 30 years, we're still going to do it for another 20 full years. That's twice as long as esports has been a thing in the West. So people are very interested in this working, and they're very invested in this working. I mean, we can even explore why that is if you want.
True. I mean, what is the appeal there? So obviously within the NFL, identifying talent is such a huge thing. Like we probably, some of your listeners will have heard of the combine, the draft combine. So you have all these physical challenges or tests, and there are expected sort of like standards in that help people identify whether someone's going to work on your team, for example, or in a particular role. They have interviews now. So there was recently a draft, and apparently one player, a high-profile player's interview went so badly that they dropped quite significantly. So there's sort of like this social interpersonal side that is, for want of a better word, tested. But then there is like, intelligence, and is this person smart? We want smart players in our team. Therefore, we're going to test their IQ in some way, and then that's going to give us an indication whether they can pick up our plays or execute under performance, do the right thing. So yeah, I can see the appeal, but isn't that absolutely hilarious? Like just the belief in this test in the face of counter evidence as well.
Yeah. For so long. There would have been people whose entire career they were recruiting players based on this test. Multiple people behind the scenes his career, over 50 years. You could have like, my dad's dad used this test. And then my dad used this test. And now I'm using this test. And someone asks, does it ever work? You're like, oh, I haven't checked. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
So
I mean, the correlation as well, like what a simple test to do. And you'd think you'd stay on top of that. You'd think you'd repeat that as much as possible. Like even it's astonishing to think the test even got off the ground without you'd think it would be like one or two surefire success stories would launch it. But anyway, carry on, because you've gone further into this with the
I think firstly to touch on why this happens and why people are so willing to keep doing this kind of thing. As soon as you can put a number to someone's football IQ, they're so willing to invest in it that they don't even check, is this number producing any accurate results in anything. And I would say it's that same fear that we've spoken about quite a few times when we talk about decision making in anything, which is the quote is, no one ever got fired for buying stocks in IBM. It's that same idea of, if you have the data can tell you that this player is a good bet and you take them and it's wrong, you're probably going to be fine. Your job is probably going to be fine. You can justify it, even if you're the owner, you can then justify it to the fans. Well, they got a 50 on the Wonderlic test. So we obviously thought they were going to develop into this fantastic talent, and they didn't, but they did get high score on the test. Whereas the second you say, okay, this person got a really low score on this test that we're measuring, but I think that this person is good and does have the potential to develop and does have a great football IQ in this context, or League of Legends IQ, then it goes wrong. Then you're in trouble. So I do think a big part of all of this stuff is this desire to have something that we pretend is concrete to point to.
Yeah.
And you can say, right, like, I got this player, they didn't work out, but they were 1.5k elo. It's like, yeah, but did you look at how good they were, or did you do it? Like, it doesn't matter, because that's a justifiable thing. If you take someone who's not challenger, then you're always going to have this problem of, if they don't perform, then it's a problem that you took them. Whereas if they do perform, it's not like you're a genius for finding them and all this kind of stuff. So it's a very, I think it's always a tempting thing. Like, if you want to go against the data, whatever the data is, or even just inherited wisdom, because the last 30 years we used the Wonderlic test, you're going out on a limb, and it is much more scary. And that's why I think, underneath it all, that's why people follow these tests, and people love the idea of having these tests. So I do think if we found a test that actually worked, it would be unbelievably useful. And if one org did it, they would be the best for sure, over a long period. But also have to be aware that you can't just be doing it because that means I can point to this thing and say, I made my decision based on that, so don't hurt me. It's that thing's fault.
Yeah, exactly. So that makes sense. Definitely the objectivity, dare I say it, like the career preservation. We did a test. We picked the person that scored the highest. But I think there are more problems here than there are upside, because there are so many unanswered questions about, if we focus on esports particularly, there are so many unanswered questions about what really matters. There are probably some scientific things we should get into. The word transfer is a big one. So, I mean, yeah, it's not just, I think the Wonderlic is based on this idea of fluid intelligence. So are we picking people that have demonstrated an ability to sort of reason and apply thinking to a high degree? And that makes intuitive sense. But there's a lot of different types of tests that have been used. So, like, just cognitive abilities have been tested. So reaction times, you might pick a player that's got the fastest reaction time, for example. Those kind of tests have been applied. We've seen personality tests, and this is where I might not make many friends, but if you dig into psychology, personality tests are generally not viewed very favorably. So if people have worked to a high level in the corporate world, they may well have taken a Myers-Briggs personality type inventory test. And there are flaws with a lot of these things, but one of the words that you'll read about when it comes to the flaws is how much of these things transfer. And the fact is, you're reducing an aspect of someone's future performance down into one value, and then when they go out there and sort of execute a skill or perform a task, they're not relying on that one dimension of their skill set, for example. So what we're essentially doing is we're separating some aspect of an environment, and then we throw them into it where it's no longer separated, and it doesn't translate into performance. So it's not just that an American football player, for example, doesn't just need fluid intelligence. They need 400 other skill attributes that are not tested by that test. So things with, for example, cognitive testing and cognitive training in particular. So the idea of, like, if we think reaction time is really important, can we go away and let's say we think it's really important in esports. Can we go away and train it using flashing lights, and then they will see an uptick in esports performance? I mean, that is heavily criticized in psychological literature at the moment, because
the idea that you can't train reaction time, or the idea that
you can train it and get better at the test,
right,
but it's not going to equate to
Yeah.
a transfer into your
Right.
performance. So the two terms there would be near transfer. So if I give you a test and over time you get better at that test, that's like absolute, you are training it and improving at the thing. But if I give you a similar test, so there's like a near transfer of that learning, and you get better at that similar test, great, near transfer works. If I give you a skill that requires that, the thing we've trained, but also a host of other things and in a different context, that will be evidence of a far transfer. So for example, if I gave you a set of lights, and when the light came on, you had to bop it, and we worked on that over time, and then we called that reaction time training, or response time training, or reflex training, whatever you want to call it. And then I put you in a Formula One vehicle, and I say you also need that skill for driving Formula One, but you're not very good at, you don't end up doing very well behind the wheel of a Formula One car. That would be an example of where like far transfer fails. So what we've trained doesn't actually transfer into the context.
Yeah. There's a thing. There's a thing here that I liked, at least when I'm looking into this S2 thing, that I liked that they mentioned. But it also does muddy the waters a bit, because it's then also, you're admitting it's less useful. They said it's prescriptive, not predictive. And I quite like that as an idea. So it's not actually going to tell you like this person is really good. Even if you look at them and they look terrible, but they scored well in the test. It's more about if like what you've done well in, like different areas that you can work on. Or if you take that example with the Formula One, if you see even those super basic reaction speed tests where it's literally like one person's holding a ruler and drops it, and however quick you catch it, you get, obviously it measures because it's a ruler. The quicker you catch it, the better your score. F1 drivers will do better in that than even any other sports athletes, pretty much consistently. Like even the ones who are 40 years old still do unbelievably well at that kind of stuff. But that doesn't mean that if you've done well in it, you will be a good Formula One driver.
Yeah.
So it's like it goes one, like once you've already got a good Formula One driver, you can bet that they will do that well.
Yeah.
Which is good from a like science point of view to sort of admit that, but it also does take a bit of the excitement out of the test. If we found one in League of Legends, this will tell you that Faker and Chovy are actually good at League of Legends. It's not that helpful.
But a really interesting comment about like the direction. So could it be that after years of driving the Formula One car and looking at those lights and anticipating when it's going to go and then reacting to it, that maybe that has been the training for the ruler test? Maybe that's kind of like you could have through the process of being on the track,
or even it's just a filter mechanism, right? Because it's not just, obviously, like reaction time in Formula One is one of the most important things, because they're just going. So I don't follow Formula One, but I know they've started in the last couple of years putting cameras like right in the visors. And if you ever see clips from that, it's just like, how is this done? How is this possible?
Yeah.
And so because the systems in the world will have good reaction times, so it might not even be that each person got better at reacting by driving Formula One, although probably they do, by driving go-karts all their life as they're growing up. But still, the system filters it so that any Formula One driver does have good reactions, because otherwise you wouldn't be in Formula One. You wouldn't be good enough.
Yeah.
So that's another like thing that makes it all this discussion more complicated. Is it the system is filtered for it? Is it something you've learned by gradually doing this thing that needs it? Or is it innate? And it was always there in your potential, and that's the thing we're trying to find if we could.
Yes. Yeah, I fully agree. It was where it gets really complex. But the correlation, I mean, just looking at the direction, I think is also is really interesting. Like when you're doing the test, what has led to what? Does the Wonderlic equate to a good football performance, or have they developed intelligence through participating in football and learning the X and O's, and that has informed the Wonderlic? That kind of thing. It's just interesting to think about, and that requires like a couple of degrees in statistics to really get your head around. But where were we?
Well, I do have another question actually, based on this reaction thing to begin with.
Yeah.
Is reaction time a trainable thing, or is it an innate, that's how fast you react? Because when we get better at it, are we getting better at the reaction tests, or are we actually getting faster reaction? Or can you train loads in one reaction test and then get a better score in a different reaction test than you got before? Is this something that's actually could be a measure of potential because it can't change, or not?
You can definitely train it, and you can. I think this is where it's a bit, when you read around the topic, it gets quite hard to separate like a performance in a given context. So like on a football field, in a car, watching your monitor on League of Legends and seeing a champion enter and reacting to that. Like let's call that like reaction time in context. So when it's like in a game situation, versus if I give you a reaction time task, you can train it and you can make improvements in it. In fact, I know a few people who've done this in League of Legends as part of just a suite of, or in esports, it's just a suite of physical training exercises. I've seen performance coaches with the light setup, I forget what it's called, the light wall or whatever, and we're seeing people like improve their reaction times. And great, that's good. It's probably part of physical fitness. It's just a suite of physical attributes that you're training, but you can definitely improve it, and you can definitely get quicker at that skill. If we then say we're going to sit you behind a screen and we're going to play League of Legends, and we're going to sort of, maybe we could modify it so that we could have a champion coming out of Fog of War, and every time you see it, you have to, I don't know, tap a button or something like that. We could probably train to get faster at that. So it's just milliseconds off your time recognizing when a champion pops onto the screen. But what's the key bit in some schools of thought? The key bit is not it is keeping perception and action connected. So if you're practicing in a given context, there are certain cues that you're primed to recognize, and the more you're in that context, the more you recognize those cues, and you can anticipate what's coming up. So it can be very hard in sports settings to actually identify whether something is just reaction time, or whether you've just learnt to perceive the cues that lead to that instance of that thing. So it's doing a poor job at breaking this down, but you can, if you work backwards from, like, if you see someone in League of Legends who you perceive to have reacted very quickly to a situation, they might have just been in that situation so often they can see the build up, they can anticipate it coming. And so what you think is quick reaction time might just be this person has learnt the cues to such a high level that they just know it's going to come. So it's not that it's like an unexpected outcome. That's the thing about separating it. So then if I went across and we just worked on the lights, tapping the lights when they flash on and off, and then we assume that's going to make people faster in that League of Legends context, it may not, because they're just not ready for those cues. And so it's actually, are we really training reaction time, or are we just spending more time in an environment and being more familiar with it, and we know what's coming up? That's the really hard thing to separate. And that's why a lot of like those pure cognitive tests fall short.
Yeah.
Did that make sense? I did such a poor job.
It did. And I think, I was actually just working with the Nord team on this kind of thing of basically, I guess the simple way to say it without talking about League of Legends is to front load as much of our thinking as possible, so that when we go into situations, you already know what you should do.
Yeah.
So that, there was a classic one from a long time ago where early on we were obsessed in esports and angry whenever someone said it's not sport. So we were obsessed about comparing it to sport all the time. And now the most recent thing I saw was the LEC was like, they basically did a video saying like, who cares? Which I think is a much better approach. Who cares if it's a sport or not? It's fun. But one of the things they did really early on, so at least 10 years ago, they had someone had flashed a Malphite ult, and then they took the frame from when Malphite first appears to when they flashed it and said he's got a faster reaction speed than Lewis Hamilton or something like that.
That's
and it's like, not at all, because he knew that the Malphite was in the bush and he's waiting to do it before the thing even starts. So again, like
Perfect
if it
example.
already, but it was just the thing that came to mind. But actually, the other thing that came to mind while you were talking, which again makes this conversation even harder, because obviously a lot of this is super interesting, so we can go everywhere. But really, the thing that with S2 or with this Wonderlic test is like using it to kind of scout people,
Right.
using it to find talent and to find the best talent. And one of the examples that I know I've heard people do in the LPL is that light test. But of course, what you just said there completely invalidates this,
Yeah.
because it's not testing your reaction time only. If you have one player who's got a slow reaction time but has done loads of this light test, he's going to be better than the other player who's quicker, will be a better player, but just hasn't ever seen this light test before.
Yeah.
So that's another problem. And this is why something like a Wonderlic test or this S2 thing, or as an example I'll come on to later, that McKinsey do for a pre-screening before their CVs, that kind of thing where it's a completely unique thing that they definitely haven't seen before, it has got a lot more merit when you're talking about finding talent, so that they're not just good at the light test, you can at least get some talent. So actually, let me ask you this then. So my approach would be, let's pretend time isn't a factor, which obviously it is, but if I had infinite time to scout people for my team, scout players, I would basically be under the impression that kind of not quite any data point is better, like more data points are better, but sort of. So maybe not just any personality test, but I would do one. And I don't know what reaction test, but I would do one. Like if I had the time, what's the downside to doing like a bunch of these tests, just going into it with the idea of like, this is not unbelievably like, because this person did really well in it, they're better, but it's more just another data point for myself, so that I can, as much as possible, make it not become, oh, I just got a feeling, because for me that's the worst. That normally, we can go into that as well, but like just my intuition about this player, that normally means that you be friends with them, which of course normally means that you're skipping out on any diversity, because they probably think similarly to you. That's why you like them. Therefore, you think it would work. So is there a downside in just saying as many data points as we can cover would be good?
Very tricky question to answer. However, I would say if you're choosing your sort of battery of tests and you're reducing them all down, not reducing them, but like you're choosing very specific things that you want to measure, and then you're testing them all in isolation, I would suggest that's probably a bit of a waste, because performance is so complex and so layered that very rarely will any of those individual skills be used or relied on in isolation. So I think it would be a waste of resources to break everything down into isolated measurements. I think that would be a waste. If there was some way you could maybe stack them together, for example, maybe doing a reaction time type test, but under some pressure, and therefore you could probably maybe get an assumption of how well this person executes mechanical skills under some pressure. That would certainly have more value than doing the reaction time test in isolation. And essentially, you're trying to get towards representativeness, so that the best talent identification system would be to do the thing you need the talent to do. But because you can't do that, you have to make these predictions. So therefore, we'd have to choose tests that are somewhat representative.
In esports, though, we can just do the thing that you want them to do, right? You can
Right.
just say whoever's the highest elo,
Well,
because they play the game, and that's what you need them to do.
Except that's not fully representative of the psychological experience. So, and yeah, let's say you pick up a player in, I don't know, let's say you pick up a jungler from an ERL and they have to relocate across Europe to Berlin to play in the LEC. Yes, they have the comparable. Let's say they had a higher rank. Like let's say they were just dominating, solo queue. They were in the top of all the ladders you can imagine. There is so much layered on top of that when they move to Berlin that you can't replicate. So you couldn't. It wouldn't be. You can't replicate the pressure of that first game in front of a fan base of passionate people that naming no regions would come after them if they perform badly after that first game. So that's the kind of thing where it's very hard to replicate, and that's why there is a phrase I read recently, which actually is quite terrifying for a coach, that talent doesn't transfer. So even if you bought the next team's biggest superstar for your team, there's no guarantee that it works in your context because there are differences. So it's, for me, I rely quite heavily on environmental things, coaching, social and psychological factors. And if they're not in a good place, I don't think you've got a good chance of bringing what you perceive to be talent into your environment and having them perform. So yeah, I agree with you. You can replicate it. You can probably be more informed in League than in many other contexts, but there are still things we could never hope to test.
I mean, also the solo queue game is very different than the competitive game.
Yeah, exactly.
And we've seen recently, Bo was a Chinese player who did unbelievably well in the LPL and then unfortunately got banned. And so came to Europe, and when he first was on the server, he wasn't allowed to play for a little while, and he just destroyed the whole server. Basically, anyone who was high elo was like super excited to watch this person play, and that of course meant everyone was. And they tried to make it work with a bunch of different teams, and it hasn't worked yet. They might still try. There's been moments where he's looked like as good as he was supposed to look, and then every team has looked much better without him. So it's a difficult one. I mean,
it's awfully difficult. But in that case, you would never say he's not talented. You would say that he's got a high level game skill, but there's just something else in that environment. It could even be like it's just his teammates. It could be his opposition, just playing in ways he hasn't developed to confront. So that could be the thing.
And that's the big question with all of this. So you just mentioned develop there. In League, we might be able to say someone's current skill actually to, I think, fairly accurately compared to American football.
Yeah.
Because you're playing in solo queue against the same players. It's like if you were a 16-year-old football player, like I'll use American football because that's what we've been talking about, playing in the NFL, like you can't play against them and see how good you stack up. Whereas in League of Legends, you can. So without a team, you can still play solo queue. And if you're good enough, you will play against caps and you'll play against like all the best players on the server. And so if you can prove, current skill, we can actually see fairly well.
Mm-hmm.
But the question then becomes, how do we see potential skill?
Yes.
Which is the enticing thing about all these tests. You can say, right, this person's 14, they're not high elo yet, but they got this amazing score on my test, which will show that they can develop with the right environment, all this kind of thing, into the player. And that's really what you're looking for. Faker has only ever been with one organization. That's what you want. You want to find the best player in the world, get them involved early and keep them, and you create a dynasty based on one good thing of scouting, basically, finding that one right player. So that's why I was asking about the reaction time thing, because if reaction time couldn't be trained, then that could be something you could test, like that maybe shows some sort of thing that's potential. Like if there's anything that we can train, firstly, we need to identify what actually makes a good League of Legends player, which
that's exactly the thing.
Something we don't have. But let's pretend we had that. Then you find those things that are unchangeable around that, and that's potential.
You would be right. Your logic works. That stands up. But I would just
the world gets in the way.
The world gets in the way, but it's also I just don't think we have the measurement tools. I'm slightly more extreme than some of my colleagues in that I'm not even a big fan of personality tests. So we have quite an enormous body of literature that's looked at core personality traits, so-called core personality traits, and there's something called the Big Five,
Yeah.
And there's this big five, which includes things like conscientiousness, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, things like that. And there's some fairly robust literature out there about how we can give someone a test and we can figure out where they are on the dimensions of these different personality traits. But I'm not even a huge fan of that literature, because if you read a bit further, you'll see that there are lots of fragments of evidence to suggest that, like, in different social scenarios, we sort of take on different personalities. Like, not that we're, not that these are like clinically relevant, for example, but it's just that we might be a certain different kind of person in different contexts. So, for example, if you think that to be a jungler, you need to be extroverted because you need to be communicative, motivational for your team, and you give someone a personality test and they score highly on that, and you say, great, this is a person for our team. But the test itself was phrased in a typical League of Legends match. How are you on these dimensions? Sure, fine, maybe that works. But actually, how reliable is it? Because if we just change the wording to when you're at dinner with your mum and dad, where are you on these? And actually, they're not probably, maybe they're completely different. They're a different type of person. So then what stock can you put in these tests if they change based on social context? Because then your high extroverted jungler might change from one day to the next depending on who's on the roster. If they perceive that there's a veteran player that they need to sort of accommodate, or they respect, or they even are nervous around, maybe they completely change. So I don't even put too much stock in personality tests. And that's without even saying that we figured out what personality fits for each role in a given game, which I highly contest. And this is where I don't make many friends, but I've seen it used and applied to team or player selection in esports. People have used these tests to try and figure out, like, well, maybe it's part of their recruitment strategy, but they've used them to figure out what personality traits does this person have? Do they fit with the role? Because we assume we know what personality works in what role.
Yeah.
And that's, to me, just like, that's pseudoscience.
I would say, I mean, yeah, but that's the thing of a high performance environment, like you can't wait for you can't wait for 100% things. You have to take some bets and some guesses.
True,
and say, like, point. Okay, look, this probably isn't exactly scientific, but I mean, I also think you can do things that make it better and worse. Like you already said there, like one of the data points, that's already making it better for me as soon as people put a huge amount of stock in it. The other thing, in terms of, I won't say where of either of these examples, but I recently, I think, saw the best version of this that I've seen and the worst.
Oh, interesting.
In the same off season. The best version was actually just about how people fit together. Nothing to do with what a jungler is good at this, but more like, okay, look, we already have these 3 players on the team and they show these kind of things. So we should be extra careful in taking another person who's like this, or, not balancing it. And again, it was very much as an extra thing, very much aware of the fact that you could give the same test again and they might score differently, all those kind of things. And it was going to be used, or was used. I mean, I didn't take the job, or get the job, I should say, in tandem with some education on the subject when people actually joined. There's a bunch of education that goes with it. There's sessions that they do with it. The very first slide in the session that I saw was, this is not who you are. This is, and already I'm like, okay, that's good. Yeah. So that was the kind of best version. Then the worst version I saw, which was I was given a management test, which was just copy and pasted and put through Google Translate. And it was kind of obvious to me that was the case. And so I did actually just Google the first few lines, with quote marks, and found the test from the 60s, which was already a bit like, okay, maybe our science has moved on. But also another thing that I see as a massive warning sign is it gave a bunch of questions which had were about management. It was like a management style thing, which gave you almost no information. And they were all incredibly leading questions. And then it ranked your answers. You got +2, +1, 0, -1, -2. And then that makes it even simpler. So you don't even have to read the responses of this person. It will just give them a score. and you can say that. And I think maybe it cost me my my chance. I don't know. I don't think so. But I wasn't. I was as polite as I could manage when giving feedback about this test. But I basically said at every single stage, well, this hasn't provided me with enough information, but it was things like, okay, your team is struggling, the output is massively reduced. Last time, some strict words helped. What do you want to do? And that was all you got. And it was like, this is wild to me. So people are using this. I think like I said, there's some that I was really impressed with and thought like, actually, this is the best version of this I've seen. And it is just a data point. And it is just, this is not defining you. And we will also give you information as to why we even do it, what it even means, what this might, if you're interested, this is all some extra things you can do. And also very much, okay, we've already got an AD carry who's like this. We want to make sure that our support is not like that, or the other way around. But also, most importantly, people kind of made it obvious that they were going to, if they disagreed with the test, then we'd do what the person thought, not what the test thought, which I think is a kind of good thing. So that's my positive and negative on this same just personality test while we stay on that.
Yeah, well said. I couldn't disagree with that. It reminds me of, there are a few tests out there which sort of, they suggest, or they try and get at preferences more than types and traits. So you might be given a small situation and you have to describe your preference for example, feedback, or your preference for communication in that, or even process in that environment. And I think that's an interesting application. So for a coach, you could feasibly, if it's close between a couple of players, you could feasibly give them a few scenarios and say, what would be your preference for handling this or seeing this decided. That, I think that's useful. And to do that, you are you identifying talent? You're identifying fit, aren't you? Really, you're identifying like what is fitting for your team environment. And so that means what you actually have to be accurate about is who you are. Are you really sure about how you would react? And those are actually all healthy conversations to have, because
and anything that it can be used to lead to another conversation, I think, is always good. Like for me, I've liked using personality tests in the past, but not even for scouting, mostly just to show people that they get different responses, which is already a useful thing. Because some of those tests, like I did a Myers-Briggs one once, where there's some answers where I was thinking like, well, there's only one answer here. And then other people answer something different. That's a really useful thing to know.
That's interesting.
Of course, like that's kind of part of the point. Like for you, there's only one answer, but for someone else, they could read that situation completely differently. And those kind of things, that can be useful. But that does stray a little bit beyond our testing topic. The other thing that I want to throw to you is, let's say you had these tests. So, I mean, maybe we'll start with just the behavioral one, but even like a reaction speed one or something like that as well. I think the other interesting thing is, when would you do them in the scouting process? So like you said, in NFL, there's like a combine. I don't know actually if the S2 stuff is done then or later. Again, if they're saying it's prescriptive, not predictive, it's probably actually used more once you've got players rather than to scout or anything like that. Of course, the one-click one was used very early on to scout people. But as an example, I mentioned this very briefly before. There's a company, McKinsey, who are a management consultancy company, sort of the biggest, or one of the big few. And so you would hope, at least, that they do all the like management side of business the best. They have to go around to other companies and tell them how to do it better. And as part of their process for getting interviews, they do a pre-screening game where you play 3 different games, I think. It's quite long. It's like an hour and a half long exam, basically, of 3 half-hour sessions on different games. And during that, it's on a browser that's even like monitoring where you're clicking and stuff like that. And then they use that in tandem with a CV to see who gets to the first stage of the interview process. So it's like right at the very beginning. And in a sense, I can see the appeal of that in the esports context as well. But actually, I would say probably I would think it's best to flip that round. And the reason being that if you're McKinsey and you're one of the biggest companies in the world that everyone or loads of people want to work for, you don't need to find the absolute best of all the candidates who apply. Like, okay, it'd be great if you could, but in the real world, you probably can't. To make the average application that actually you see higher is a huge bonus. You know, if you can send people this thing that automatically gets sent to them, and it can just highlight extra things that you know, give people bump up the ladder if they did really well on the game, that is super valuable for a company and well worth spending however much. You know, if you can make the interview process 5% more efficient, but you're interviewing 100,000 people a year, that's a huge amount more efficient. Whereas if you've got 5 players on your team and you can make it 5% more efficient, firstly, it's not all that much worth it. But also, because it's a direct competition game, it's not about making your scouting slightly better. It's about finding that one like diamond in the rough that no one else sees. So if we had these tests, if you could do a League of Legends version of S2, for example, before we even get to what might be on it, where do you think would be the best place to even do this test? At the beginning, at the end, like just gut feeling? You don't have to, it's not a correct answer to any of this.
Can I, a quick sidebar?
Yeah, of course.
In my day as a basketball coach, I frequently had to run tryouts for teams, and probably the best talent ID I ever talent ID decision that I made was on was for a women's basketball team where I was working at a sort of an organization over the summer, and then going into the start of the season in the winter, I had to make a decision about the team, and I just so happened to be in this region where there was like this athletic event over the summer, and then going into this basketball season. But over the summer, the organization I was working for was doing a lot of things like flag football and things like that. And I just so happened to see a woman who had never really played flag football before, but she made a catch, and the catch of this flag football was astonishing to me for someone that's never played before, because it was a jump, difficult sort of. It was quite high up. It was at an angle. It wasn't immediately above her, and she caught it with 2 hands and under contact, which you're not meant to have with flag football, but under contact, held onto it, brought it down, secured the play or whatever. And then my gut was like, well, this person can jump, catch, and retain possession under some pressure. This could be worth the 12th spot on my basketball team for this season. And yeah, made the connection and said, would you be interested? And not someone that perceived himself as a basketball player, did very well over the course of the season. So going to your tests there, if I'm trying to filter out some of the applicants based on test, you're also sort of cutting out people who may be different in terms of how much they've experienced that test. So your diamond in the rough could be someone that's actually, it could be like you or me, could be an amazing Formula One driver. We just haven't spent enough time behind the wheel. So if I'm using the test, it kind of depends on, do I need a performer right now, or can I invest in someone to develop long term? So if I'm already trying to just reduce the number of applications because I'm trying to get someone that can perform right now, that kind of makes sense to do the test early. But your question is not that. It's
I guess it's an impossible question as well, because it depends what the test is. Because so like I say, if we can measure like current skill playing the game some way by doing solo queue, and when I say this, I'm not saying you just take what their ELO is, but because all the API is public, or not public, but you can get access to it. So many teams, Fnatic are very impressed with their own like numbers system, but every team has some version of that. Some rely on it more, some rely on it less. But it's not just how high elo you are, it's loads of things like where you're clicking, how aggressive you are, all those kind of things. So let's, maybe those kind of tests, I think, can absolutely be done first. And that gives you a list of candidates. But stuff that's completely different, like, personality tests on the exact other end, the opposite, much less concrete, much more, that should be maybe the other end of the process as well. So start with the current skill and then talk about or think about like potential and stuff like that. But this is the thing, is that basically I think the more I'm realizing is sort of like an hour in, is that if we don't know actually what makes a good League of Legends player,
what really matters,
then how can we start with any of this?
Yeah, what really matters. And then also, are we so confident that we've got it right in those that have, like, in our current processes, are we so confident that we're doing the right thing? Or actually, this is kind of a bit of a curveball for you, but I don't think I'm making this up. There is a team somewhere who, not an esports team, a professional sports team, they did away with their academy setup. And rather than have an academy setup, which brought in youngsters to develop, they set up a reserve team, and they saved enormous amounts of money by, I think this is true, they just recruited players that have been let go from other academies and brought them in and sort of gave them like a second chance squad. And they did exceedingly well, and the costs were exceedingly low. And I think by all measure, they exceeded what they wanted because they were well on budget and the performance was reasonable for that return. And so actually, what that struck me as interesting, because it's like, we know that skill acquisition, skill development, expertise development is not linear. So it's not that like the more time you spend doing something, you're going to get incrementally better on a predictable basis. It could be that you start doing something, you get worse at it, you lose confidence, for example, and then you figure out how it goes, and then you make a jump and you get really good. And that even that might fluctuate a little bit. So if that's the case, and I'm starting my League of Legends team, I might try and do the best I can to make sure that I'm as confident as I can be about the environment in which my players are stepping into. As you do, you analyze that environment, the process around the team. I'd make sure that I'm as confident in that as possible, and then I'd pick people that maybe have had some experience, that might be hungry for a second chance, that have shown that they're not going to blow up a team, can maintain some degree of proficiency. And I might then believe that my environment is better than where they've been, and my environment can bring the best out in them, and then put them into it. Now, if there's a test in there, I'm not sure, but I just quite like there was a couple of cool papers, for example, on talent development and talent identification in sport, and they used this expression of a rocky road. So the path to the top, you have to follow a rocky road. So it's not all smooth sailing, and maybe there are highs and lows. So maybe we pick a few people that, I'm dodging the question here, but you get what I'm driving at.
Yeah. No, I think actually, with the way things are now, that is probably the best way to go. I think, and it also depends on what position you're in, Okay, so G2 spend the most on League of Legends, on, well, most of the esports that they're in. And so they don't need to think differently about how they scout players, because other than very specific situations, they get the players they want, because also anyone wants to play with caps, because you'll probably win. Whereas if the lower down the list you go, I think you should start looking at other things to find talent that other people have missed.
Yes.
And so I've given this advice to multiple ERLs in the past, ERL teams in the past. Before the LEC, the best value for money among players was almost always rookies. Because I don't know, it's not really exactly relevant, but I'm going to explain why anyway. Because when it wasn't a franchised league, there were players who just sort of hung around what was called the EU LCS because people knew, like, okay, you're not going to win with them, but you probably won't get demoted with them. Whereas if you take a rookie, it might blow up and you get demoted, because the difference between being in the EU LCS and being in an ERL at the time was like, it's not half as much, it's like 1% as much or less. And so because of that, there were people who are definitely good enough to be in the top league for ages that weren't there. And so you saw in the first split of the LEC, you saw loads of rookies come in, like Humanoid, Nemesis, all these kind of people. And well, Kazi and all those, like loads of people. The list goes on and on and on. There were 20 rookies or something, at least. And then the next year, again, the same, loads and loads of rookies. But it did start to slow down. It's increased again, actually, this year, but that's a whole different topic. It did start to slow down. And what has happened now, in my opinion, is that we have way too set an opinion on players. And I see people telling me, like, we should get this rookie because he's going to be better than this really established player. And I just, like, it's so often it's just completely not the case. So I do think it's really important to also be considering with these tests and with everything, is it good business sense for you to be paying attention to these? And if you're already the best team, you've got much less, or the biggest budget, you've got much less to gain from trying a test and a reaction speed thing and making your own system and all that kind of stuff, because you can just find the people that we all agree are good and they're the highest elo people, and you can just take them and put them on your team because you give them the most money and you've got the best reason for joining. Whereas if you're the rookie team in the LEC, you could be also the bottom team in the LEC, you should be trying to think differently. And absolutely, I do think actually ERLs now, the best value for money is people who you think you know how good they are. So we played with, last split, we played with like Santorin, Treats and Matty, or even Vizicachi. Like, there are people who, okay, Santorin actually just chose not to be in the top league anymore. He got loads of offers, but there are other people where it's just like, why are these players not getting loads of really good offers? It's because they've got a name that people recognize. Honestly, like, there are people who have changed their name and got more offers because it's a new, exciting rookie rather than a player who's been around for ages. And so it is interesting. And I do think it is important when considering all this stuff to think about what is the actual benefit for us as an organization, and is this a way that we can find people that other people miss?
Yeah.
Because, okay, we have to go down the list a bit because the top 5 on everyone's list are going somewhere else, or the top 10. Or if you're the 10th place budget, maybe the top, more than the top, whatever 9 times 5 is, more than the top 45, because there's also a bunch of players who think they're too good to be on your team. So now for you to scout talent, now it is time to think about, okay, where else can we go? But also, how else can we find something that tells us this person might have some potential, or I don't know, something like that.
Yeah. I'd love it. I mean, I like that way of thinking. I'm a big fan of the player with a chip on their shoulder, but in not just that they've got a chip on their shoulder, but like more that it's kind of just, we don't have many. There aren't many walks of, like, areas of life where you can really have a second chance story. And I think in sport, you can, if you really, as a coach, show that you believe in someone and you give someone a sort of a chance to bounce back, I think you can really do some wonderful things. And it's really interesting about what you say there about having to change their name to get another shot. Is that just, for content?
It's more, no. I mean, I don't know if anyone's actually done it specifically to try and get another shot, but I do know several situations where casters especially and fans were really excited about this player, but last split they weren't, because he just changed his name. He just has a different name when he's playing, and they're like, oh my god, this is exciting, I haven't had this guy before, and he's just got a triple kill. Before it's like, oh, this guy's washed, but he's still doing well, but he's washed. And like all that kind of thing, I think is really crazy. I mean, we talked about it a little bit last time with the EU Masters thing with like Lost Ratones players who everyone thinks they know how good Crownie is because he was in the LEC before. And that's it, So sometimes that can be it. And so it actually is the best value for a lot of teams now, is actually in experienced players. and finding a way to actually get more out of them
Yeah.
is. But yeah, I mean that was sort of a little bit of a tangent. Let me just go through, because I figured I'd bring it up, the things that they say they test for football on this S2 thing. So of course, how you test these things, how they test these things, they're obviously not going to tell us. There's a massive thing where this is done on an Xbox, like with an Xbox controller. So of course, talking about transfer, all those kind of things, I think is important. But let me just read through. So the skills breakdown that they've got for, I think they mostly are focused on quarterbacks, because that's the sort of key position in American football. It's perception speed. So how fast you process the speed of the game. Search efficiency, which is how quickly can you scan and filter information. Tracking capacity, so seeing the whole picture. Visual learning, so that's sort of like pattern recognition kind of stuff. Distraction control, so how much you can focus. Impulse control, which I guess would be the sort of fast and slow thinking kind of idea, which is very important for League of Legends players, by the way, and something which, if there was a way to test that, I think that is something that I think is really worth it. Making sure there's at least one person on the team who's actually able to control their short-term reactions to stuff and override it and think more long-term. Decision complexity, which is how fast can you execute and react to decisions. A lot of these sounds very similar. Instinctive learning, how quickly do you pick up on opponents' tendencies. And improvisation. So these are the 9 things that they test. If we were to come up with, well, firstly, what do you think about them? But secondly, if we were to come up with League of Legends ones, like, does that not just apply to every sport? Like, they say they're sport specific, but other than,
well, they could be sport specific. Obviously, I haven't seen the test, but if they're, I don't know if you had this, but like if you do a driving theory test, and they'll present you with a video of a scenario, and then they'll freeze it, and they'll say, like, what
you
three
have to
things.
click the hazards as they come up.
Yeah.
If it's
a great
like example, actually, that would be quite a good way to do it.
I mean, I think that's the way you would do it. Like in terms of like visual search, for example, like that would be representative in some respects, minus the psychological effects. And I know that actually my colleague, Ismail, performance manager at G2, one of his PhD studies, he actually, I can't remember if he takes a screenshot from a game and he's asked coaches and professionals to sort of reverse engineer it, like what's led up to it, as like a way of examining decision making. Or maybe I think he takes a screenshot and then he says, like, what are the 3 options, or generate options from this point forward. But regardless, like that is a fairly representative way of doing it. So if they were doing that, so like showing a video pause, and then you would ask to describe certain aspects of it for in terms of visual search, that could be quite useful. And that's where you might expect to see at least a big difference between novice and expert performer. Does it tell you enough to separate expert from expert? Because there might be different ways of doing the same thing. That could be tough.
But yeah. I'm actually thinking as well, like with that kind of exercise, or even we're working with these MOBA trainer guys, and I actually think now that I'm thinking in this conversation, something like that would be incredibly useful as part of a scouting process.
Yeah.
But the way that I would do it, if I could just snap my fingers and make it happen, is, so that's strategical puzzles in League of Legends. They actually have also a like reaction speed thing that's very specific. You're a little character and abilities fly at you that look like League of Legends abilities at the speed that League of Legends abilities fly at you. So the Ari charm flies at you at the same speed of an Ari charm, and you just see how long you can survive, basically. Which is also, I also think actually would be a very useful thing to know about your players, again, as another data point.
Yeah.
But the thing that I would do definitely is get them to do a series of puzzles. Everyone does the same series of puzzles. The puzzles just have the options. There's 5 different options available, and you click which one you think. And then rather than having what the system is now, which is answers, I would instead have no answers, and the player records it while they're going through it. Like you might do in a driving test. I was advised to do this actually by my driving instructor, is that actually it's really helpful for you as you drive around to just talk out loud, because you might get minors or even major errors by things that you did recognize, but the instructor didn't think you did. So it's like, I've
Yes.
seen that person walking up to the pedestrian crossing, and I'm going
That's
to
great.
check if they look across it, and then if they, as you're going, they suddenly dart across, you probably wouldn't get a minor, but you would have before, because they thought, oh, you just didn't know, all
Yep.
those kind of things. So finding a way to test, even if it is like reverse engineer this scenario or present me with the options or puzzles. But as you're doing this test, you record the person doing it and say, please explain your thinking as you go. Take as much time as you need or whatever.
Mhm.
Then you can start to see how they think about the game, of course, which is malleable. So I think one of the reasons people don't do this too much with players is that I'm like, well, I'll teach them how to think about the game. But I think that's a bit of a silly thing
Right.
to do, especially when there's a short time frame. But also see your thinking behind it. So why do you think
Yeah.
this? Why did you choose that option as opposed to the other options? And that kind of thing could be quite fun.
Bingo.
Could be quite useful, actually.
Yeah. Bingo. That's everything that was missing earlier. Like, when we were talking about what kind of tests, and you had that management test, and you didn't have the opportunity to, you were like presented with the situation and told there was a right answer, when in fact you had your own thinking behind it, and the thinking itself could have been brilliant, and it might be something that they hadn't anticipated, for example. It's worth listening to. And I'm fully on board with that. So that, assuming those aspects of like the S2 are sport specific in that way, that would all make sense. But I think what we've arrived at there is that there isn't necessarily an outcome that we desire, but there is a way of thinking that we would maybe prefer, and having an indication of that would be really useful.
Yeah.
And it really is interesting to think about in terms of League of Legends, because it's you do have a good idea of skill. Like, you can be fairly certain about skill, and you're just trying to make the assessment of fit and the management of the emotional, psychological, social side of it, which can be even harder to determine. Yeah, lost my train of thought a little bit, but it's I think
I mean,
progress.
like I say, like I think the skill thing is useful. The challenge for League of Legends is the potential thing, because as soon as someone is really high elo, everyone's looking at them. And so for most teams, all ERL teams, of course, but even most teams in the LEC, it's about finding the player before. So again, Faker's on T1 before people are talking about how hyped this kid is from solo queue. He's in the org actually before he's legally allowed to play, and he plays there for years. Or the Shy, who has had a very up and down career, I always use this example, was brought to China at like 14 or something to train with the IG team, and then is only allowed to play at 17. But all until then is in this environment, streaming and playing and that kind of thing. And so finding potential, I think, is the really big thing, but maybe too difficult. So I don't want us to just keep going back and forth on this, because there's so much more things to talk about. But if we can try and get to some advice for people who are trying to do this, like this is my summary, at least from what we've talked about so far, that I think is useful. But let's try and add to it.
Yeah.
Firstly, this prescriptive, not predictive thing, I think is really important. Like, make sure that you're aware that it's not, if they do well on these tests, they are good. Maybe even the way that I would say it is like, think about it as if it's just another opinion. So I should bring another coach or manager or whatever to listen to the interviews that I've done with someone to get their opinion. And then it's also like, okay, I think they're good because they look good when they play. I like the way they control their character. They seem to react really quickly in the game. And then the reaction speed tests tell me they're really good, high on the reaction speed test. Like, it's just another person saying, maybe this is useful. And then, of course, you can have the thing of, if you keep using the same tests, you'll start to, like, if you keep asking the same person for advice on players, the more they tell you this player is good and they are good, you'd gradually build up some sort of trust or lack of trust with these tests. So yeah, make sure you're taking it as advice and not saying like, okay, it will predict things. I would say do like varied things. I would say as much as possible, if it's ever about League of Legends IQ, make sure you're getting the thinking, not just the answer. And I would say,
Yes.
again,
Yes.
maybe most of these are just from my bad experience, but the last one is don't mark stuff. Don't, if it's like, what are the three options here? And if they click this option, it's like +2. This option is like, don't do that.
Yeah.
Just hear how they think about it, and
Yes.
and use the tests to put them in a new situation. Again, another one to remember: if you're using a test like a reaction speed test, do check if they've done it before, because if they've done it before, they'll be better at it.
Yep.
But yeah, use all these tests as a way to see, hopefully, beneath what they're thinking, rather than as a way to just tell you if someone's good or not.
Yeah. One that we touched on, I think, is really important, is have a very clear understanding of your own performance model. You need to be, I think maybe that's maybe first and foremost, like when you're recruiting for your team, what are you aware of what you really value, or are you thinking that is important? But actually, if you are, let's say you're the coach of the team, and you're if you are going to go into a test of, let's say, personality, because you think you should do, because I think you think it will give you a good idea of fit, but then actually you really couldn't care less about personalities and how people get on. You just want to see like work ethic, for example. Then like, why are you testing that thing? So make sure you have a really good idea of what you actually want and what you actually want to see and what you think is really important. Because without that, the tests are arbitrary and meaningless. So I think that's really important. And I think there is something to be said for, like, obviously the interview and conversation to get an idea of who these people are as a person is quite interesting. But yeah, just looking at what else is going on in the broader life. So it's +1 for the interview, but it's interesting, I think, as well, to note that if you're looking at a new player, this is counter to what I said earlier about development being non-linear. But you could be dealing with someone that's only played for a short amount of time and they're a high responder. Or so, for example, like in a short amount of time, they've developed massively and they've hit their stride finding League of Legends, and there's like a wealth of potential still to go. Or they've been playing for a long time and they've struggled with it, and you think that means they're not good, but actually you dive into it a little bit and you realize they've just never been in the optimal situation. So I think going that a step further to understand that before you go into the sort of minutiae of testing. Losing my train of thought again, but yes, what you said captures it, and I think having that performance model is perhaps most important.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and I think that's a step that a lot of people don't do or haven't done. You know, what even is whatever your org is called, player? What even is a Nord player for us, right? It's not something that anyone's ever thought of before. Obviously,
what way of thinking do we want to see amongst our players at Nord?
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, and I mean, in a case like Nord, it's actually not possible to have done that kind of thinking before, but in bigger teams, it absolutely would have been.
Right.
So it's just something that needs to be done. And like, what kind of things do we value? And that will, again, lead you to people that other people miss. Because if you value work ethic above everything else, you might take the harder worker as opposed to the person who's a little bit better. And that might mean that you're going to pay less for them for how good they are and all those kind of things. So I think there's a lot to be done there. I think as well, maybe this isn't a good way to think about it, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. You mentioned interviews as well, and I've always thought of the idea of having multiple interviews and multiple, like some that are set up and some and like planned, and I send the questions in advance, and some that are kind of a bit more improvised. And the way that I would kind of go about it, at least in my head, is almost giving someone multiple different opportunities to shine and to impress me, as it were.
Well said.
And maybe you can think about the tests in the same way. It's not even to be thinking about it. Obviously, actually, at the end of the day, because you can only pick one player per role, doesn't really matter. And you could say, you know, if I'm using it to exclude people rather than to use it to show up good people, if it shows up one good person, that means, you know, it still ends up maybe in the same place. But I do think it's a slightly more healthy mindset to approach it with, of like, okay, here's a bunch of these things that could show me interesting things about this person that might make them a perfect fit for my team.
Yeah, I like that. Really like that. What a healthy way of thinking as a coach as well, because you want people to be at their best, so you give them multiple opportunities to do so. The one caveat would be do you trust yourself as a coach to pick to select? You've got 2 players after your process, and it's the age-old problem. Do you go with the player that's impressed on all of the sort of holistic side of things and the interpersonal, and they've really like got on with every member of the team, they've resonated in all of the interviews and conversations, but they just haven't produced on the Rift, versus the player that's just dominated on the Rift, but like hasn't done so well outside of it? Like
I think that has to be answered from an org point of view, but it's a perfect question.
Right.
Yeah.
Good point. Yeah, true.
Yeah,
I think that's
it's
the
really
age-old
hard.
one.
It's really, really hard. I can't remember what I was going to say. I was just about to say something else as well. Oh yeah, I mean, also I think it's really important, and with all these tests, that you're very aware of who you are as a person, because for me, I do think I'm very good at interviewing people and talking to people in the sense of making a good interview, but I am terrible, I think, at an interview process, at like recruiting people. Now, I think that I spend a lot of time thinking about how to interview people, and I think I would hope to improve basically any team's interview process. But me actually doing it and making the decision based on it, I don't think I'm actually very good at, because I get really excited about, like I said, when other people show me things that are interesting about them. And so I can ignore subconsciously, without even realizing it, I could ignore certain other things if they've just done some things that make me really excited. Like we had a fantastic conversation about this random thing that's maybe not even particularly relevant, but it then skews my thinking on all the other stuff, because I love that about me as a coach, but it makes me very not suited necessarily for doing the actual decision-making part of the interview process, which is why I would record my interviews and send them to someone who's maybe a bit more out of the loop, but also a bit more like, okay, look, we need to avoid this warning sign. Or I think I might have talked about the matrix thing that I would set up for future interviews, so that I can make sure I'm making a note of the things that could be potential warning signs, so that I can allow myself to be excited by this person and not miss out on stuff that could actually be problems. So yeah, with all of this stuff, really important to be aware of why it could be useful for you personally. It's not going to be useful for you in the same way as me or anyone listening. It'll be all very, 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 very unique.
Yeah, in saying that, that has given me some thoughts as well about our own bias, and like if we're getting on with someone really well, that sort of throws out the usefulness of that. Yeah, if you're having a wonderful interview, you're really getting on with someone because there's like a topic you're both passionate about, but it's not actually the game, and playing the game under these conditions, it's actually not representative. So that would be something to be careful of.
I mean, I've said this before, but I'll say it again. I'm aware that often intuition is the best we've got when we're interviewing people, because we don't have all these tests, and just like I just felt that this is good. But I would tell people that you should be unbelievably cautious about that, because if intuition is like based on past experiences and you've not interviewed, maybe if you're the hiring manager for a global company, maybe you can just rely on your intuition and your intuition will be good. But I mean, it's like you take chess as an example. Magnus Carlsen, greatest chess player of all time. I think that's starting to even be not a controversial statement. A few years ago, you had to say like with some caveats, but now I think it's just pretty much agreed. He talked at one point about how when he really he went from being unbelievably good to incredibly good, is when he actually just started to rely on his intuition more and think about positions less, and like sort of feel positions more. But at that point, he's seen hundreds of thousands of chess positions, and he has this unbelievable memory of chess positions. And so when someone says, "Oh, I just had this really I rely on my gut to tell me which of these two candidates to take," my thing that I think is a big danger is that when you meet someone, what your gut is telling you is not if they're going to be good for your position, is if you're going to be their friend or not. And that's not necessarily something that you need or even is good. And that's why people recruit people who are like them. And completely separate and not useful in esports, but just an interesting fact, you get a lot more diversity if you recruit people in groups, because when you're recruiting one person, you just find the person who's like the least risky, and the least risky to you is the person who's most like you. And your intuition is actually based on, you meet thousands of people in your life, and mostly you're judging them whether you want to spend time with them and like hang out with them. And so when you meet them in a professional context, your intuition is still doing that, whether you know it or not. And so if you hire in groups, supposedly, it massively reduces okay, if I'm even politically right wing, I might hire people who are politically right wing or left wing, or, all those things. Or like you say, we find a topic that we both are really passionate about and could chat about for ages, and it's not actually relevant. Or even if it is relevant, it's not the only thing that's relevant, and it then biases everything else. So yeah, huge amount there. And again, that makes me think these kind of tests would be great, but I think they're still not possible other than just as another data point.
Yeah. How does the group thing work? So you have...
I can't remember it exactly. I'll try and find it. It was a guy who I really like listening to called Rory Sutherland, who's a behavioral psychologist, talking about the fact that if you hire in groups, so like I'm going to hire 10 people at once, rather than one person, you get far more diversity, even 2 or 3 people at once rather than one person. Because when you hire one person, people naturally take the person who's the least risky. Because if your one hire goes badly, then it's your fault. And if one of your 5 goes badly, then it's your fault. And the way that already would be maybe problematic, but probably fine. But the thing that makes it problematic is that when we think someone is less risky in an interview process, it's mostly just because they're most similar to us. So that's where you get the problem with diversity. Men are more likely to hire men if you're hiring one person, and so on. So yeah, an interesting thing to think. You can't really do that in League of Legends, because when you're hiring a top laner, you can't hire 10. But
that also throws
a good thing about an academy team. You hire 2, make one of them risky.
Yeah,
or 10 players
I like that. Yeah, and we know that like the top performers in the world are extraordinary because they do things differently. So it's quite you don't, if you're an average middle of the road or poor League of Legends player like I am, I don't want to hire someone that does what I do. But that's another interesting caveat to the idea of, I think, what throughout this conversation, like what has like struck me as really, really useful is to, if you're trialing a player, you want some evidence of their thought process. So get them to play the game and talk through the decisions they're making in the game, and like really talk about what they're thinking and why they're doing what they're doing. I think that's really, really cool. The problem is, how do you make that assessment of that? If you agree with their thinking or you disagree with their thinking? Because if you disagree with their thinking, you're probably going to view it less favorably. If the outcome is good, did they know something that you didn't, and then you stand to gain from that? Or do you trust your intuition that you had the right way of thinking?
Yeah.
I
think you would need to know a lot about the game to approach that kind of thing. Because what I'm instantly thinking when I mention that is, what kind of things are they evaluating? What kind of things do they think are important and less important? Are there things that they're just completely missing? Because actually, if there are things that they're completely missing, that shows more potential. If there's just something that they just don't consider, then that actually means that, okay, this person is this good, having never considered X thing, that I can just tell them or teach them.
Yes.
It could be literally as simple as telling them.
Yeah.
Actually, remember, by the way, that the most important thing is whose flash is up, and you didn't consider that. Now, if I can get them to consider it, they're going to be a big jump better.
Oh.
So finding a player who's like really high elo but ignores some basic things is like the dream.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good point. Oh, that's very appealing. I like that way of thinking. I want a inherently flawed superstar.
Yeah, exactly.
Like you want with like really basic flaws.
Yeah. You want like the next faker, but they just have one big flaw that you can tell them and just fix. If you can just identify what that flaw is.
That is hilarious. I like that a lot.
Okay, I think that's a good way to end. We've done another 90 minutes on this, and I think hopefully we provided some use, but at the very least we started to explore this unbelievably complicated area. So it was great fun as always, but not really got a conclusion other than here are some things to think about, and potentially people came into this episode thinking, I think tests could be a good thing, and now leave thinking it's complicated.
Yeah,
And even
that would be
that
a good
is probably a good takeaway. There's maybe some advice that we've got to between us, but mostly it's complicated.
Yeah, very complicated. And I would say I could hang my hat on the idea of representativeness. So if you're thinking about doing tests, how representative is that of the actual skill that you want them to perform, considering all of the layers of performance? So like you step into a competitive space for a team, your performance really matters. If you put yourself in those shoes of the energy, the intensity, the anxiety, the nervousness, all of that layered on top of it, you can't separate that from the skill. And so if you're just testing the skill, it's unlikely to be reproduced in exactly the same way if you layer all that back on top of it. So try and make these things representative if you can, and then all the other things we've said. Yeah. But as you say, it's complicated. It's like,
yeah, it's complicated. As with so many things in coaching, it's complicated.
Yeah, exactly. But fun to talk about.
Yeah. Well, thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you probably next week, but we still haven't decided exactly because we've got random scrim timings that keep changing. So it was my fault we didn't have one last week, and hopefully we'll have